Hello and good morning. My name is Steve Pugh. It's Friday. I think it's Friday, the 3rd of November. I do various different podcasts and live streams on the internet. I also run a startup called Roadmap MBA, and our mission is to bring free business education to the world to really help people kind of develop their careers and also launch businesses and follow their passions and that kind of thing. And I try and be as generally useful as I can. One of the things which actually came up 3 times just this week was people who wanted to know, what do I need to do to start a podcast? What kit do I need? What software do I use? How do I do it? All of that kind of stuff. And when it happens 3 times in a week, although I haven't done one of these live streams in a while, I've just been busy doing other interviews and other stuff. I thought, why not? It could be a topic that people are interested in as well. But if you actually get involved in the comments and drop in a quick message, it should pop up on the screen. And what I'll also try and do is answer any questions that come in as much as I can. And I'll also share some of my kind of background and some of the stuff I do and why I do it and that kind of thing as well. But the hope is just to kind of have a resource which I can then direct people to, so that if people ever ask me stuff, which I have had a few times this week, hopefully I can kind of direct them to it. It's a more in-depth thing than, I guess, repeat myself different times and maybe missing something out and that kind of thing as well. So launching a podcast is something that's obviously very popular at the moment. I think it really kind of kicked off during the pandemic. And there's different types of things to consider. You have your really big famous ones like Joe Rogan, where you have celebrities generally and they all interview each other. And actually that's what I kind of watch, which is quite cool. But also you then get into more a niche specialist kind of thing to do with different topics. And what I'd almost recommend is that if you have a particular niche, maybe try and kind of focus on that. But what I'm going to do over the next kind of half an hour or so is go over the why. Why do you want to start one? What do you want to talk about? The kit that you need, both in terms of kind of basic stuff and more advanced. So you don't need one of these necessarily for doing what I've got the setup here, but actually you can start with just a smartphone. You don't need anything particularly complicated. We're going to cover, should you go live or pre-recorded? This is a big one, and it's so much harder to go live, but I'm going to explain why and actually the benefits to do that should you wish. Your location. So do you want to broadcast from the same place every time, which is kind of what I do, but actually then relating to that for your guests, both who do you invite, why do you want to invite them, and also do they physically have to come to you, because that might limit who you can speak to, and then if not, how can you kind of make that work as well. I'm going to talk about cameras, which is one of the main things that people normally kind of ask me about, and that includes different lenses and different ideas and stuff that might, I'll explain how and why different things do different things. I'll cover sound briefly, then we've got lighting, editing, and also kind of broadcast production, and then also distribution. So hopefully this might be interesting. If you have zero interest in launching a podcast or anything like that, just ignore this, just skip past, and that's absolutely cool. But actually, if you do want to check out any of our stuff and the past interviews that we've done, go to roadmapmba.com or search for us on YouTube or on the different socials, and you'll probably see examples of different kind of things and setups. Because in this room, which is essentially, it's like a TV studio, we have different setups set up for different reasons to do different things. One is the broadcast setup, which is like this, which is, you'll see the moving camera, and it's a more of a classroom kind of setup. And then we also have a slightly more intimate interview setup with a blurred background and a big sign on the wall, and it's designed for a different thing, and I'll kind of cover that as well. Okay. So the first question, if you want to launch a podcast, is why do you want to launch the podcast? It could be just for fun. I actually really enjoy doing it, and I love speaking to different people. Actually, I would do it for free. I use it as a way to help boost profile for the business, but actually, kind of think that through. Is it for business development? Because there's 2 angles on this one. Is it to help raise awareness of your knowledge and expertise in an area? Or you could do a podcast about microphones or whatever it is you sell, and actually, find your niche. So even if you run a CNC machine shop, you could actually do a CNC machine podcast and talk about what's new in different types of machines. But the idea is you can use it as a business development tool to raise awareness of the kit and your expertise in an area. But you can also use it when you target people as a business development tool in the people that you target. So for instance, if you want to get to know certain people better, you can message them and say, would you like to be on my podcast? I'd love to share your story, etc. But you're still using it as a business development tool, but not more in an indirect manner, if that makes sense. Next is a lot of people, and no, don't be ashamed of it. It's almost just to be honest about it. It's about profile. So most people, not everyone, likes to stand on a stage, be recognized for what they do, and have some sort of recognition in the industry about what they do and how it works, and hopefully be known for something. Having a podcast and inviting guests on, and especially when you start to share that content, if it gets traction, is a great way to build your personal profile and your personal brand. One of the big things that I'm very keen on is that in long form content, when essentially you just talk for an hour, over time, people kind of get to know you a little bit as well. So that again has benefits in building trust with your audience and that kind of thing. And last but not least, and I just want to break any misnomers on this, some people think that they will launch a podcast and make money. And whilst that is technically possible, it's very, very, very unlikely to happen unless you really hit something ridiculous and do a Joe Rogan and get paid $100 million to host a show. Because that's the other side to it as well. People, we describe them as podcasts, but often now most podcasts that we see and interact with, I at least watch mine on YouTube because I want to see the person as well as hear them. So essentially what you're actually looking at is an interview talk show, not just a podcast. And because of that, almost the way that you should imagine it is different because there's so much more to consider. You absolutely, if you wanted to, can just start an audio only podcast. And some people do, but I think you're then missing a trick later on when we come to distribution and social media, because actually I know that if I see a podcast which is just audio, I tend to skip past it. Is where if it's someone that I recognize, I might watch 20 seconds to kind of get the gist. But I do that when it has the video element to it, and it's an important thing to keep in mind. But on the money points, so with our Roadmap MBA YouTube channel, we got monetized about 2 years ago, I think. And even for, I think it's 10,000 views, you got something like £60. So it's not a huge amount of money considering the time and effort to actually go in and build a podcast and do all the stuff. And actually one of the things that we decided to do is that with any business, you want to build something which your customers like or love. And one of the things that we found is that you essentially get paid on YouTube if you show adverts. But the irony is our customers hated the adverts. So I took all the monetization off. So now when we do all of our content, it is purely about brand and adding value and that kind of stuff. And although we had the potential, I have been paid from Google and YouTube and stuff to do content, I actually took it off because it was hurting the longer term goal for what we were looking to do. And it was just something to consider. But likewise, if you think it's a get rich quick thing or you're going to earn a few grand a month, it might be harder than you think. Okay. So the next one is, what topic do you talk about? So I basically have two main shows that I kind of do. One is a podcast interview where essentially what I do is ask the guest and share their story and, have a great conversation and hopefully, use that to create interest. And then I also have this one, which is more of a live stream. And essentially what we do here is try and add value, answer questions that people have, cover topics that people might find interesting, and actually use that as the driver to, I guess, demonstrate expertise and knowledge and that kind of thing. And it's something that I will touch on later on. But the other thing which is really important to a small business, which is essentially what we are at Roadmap MBA, we choose to live stream because often what happens is that when we actually come to broadcast, of the 20,000 connections that I've got on LinkedIn and across the other kind of social platforms that we do, hopefully people get a little push notification to say, Steve Pugh is live. And actually today they will have hopefully got Learn to Podcast, something, the heading that my hope is for anyone that wants to learn to podcast, they will actually see the little pop-up and they might come in and watch or join later. And if we didn't live stream and we just pre-recorded, people never get that. So it's something that's really important to talk about. But actually in terms of the topic and what do you do, You need to think about something that actually, is there something that you could do week in, week out, or every 2 weeks, or every once a month, but you're happy to keep doing forever, or for a year, or for 2 years, to be actually consistent with. Because if you hate the idea of being on video, or you don't have the time to do it, or whichever, I wouldn't even start, because a one-off thing is really expensive. And actually, it takes ages to learn all of the craft and learn all the stuff that actually do something that you would love to do. One of the guys that approached me had like a model business, so kind of Warhammer type army model stuff. So for instance, for him, he could actually do a show about what he does. It could be new characters or trends or discussion topics or even live gameplay, because for his audience, that would be hopefully really good content. It's not for me, but it's for, you want to do something for your kind of audience. But likewise, if you hate being on camera and you hate talking to people and put yourself out there, I wouldn't even start. It's a really important thing to think about. Likewise as well, one of the kind of slightly cop-out things that I do with the interviews, but I think it's true with all of the interview channels, is as long as you can keep finding new guests, you've always got new content as well. Likewise, if you wanted to do a show which was always about trying to think of new content, new things to talk about, you can really quickly run out of ideas, and therefore it dies just because you run out of ideas of stuff to do. So actually that could be an angle, but what I'd say is that when you do interview people, put a slant on it based on what your expertise is or the topic that you want to kind of talk about. But consistency is the real key. I do see people really well intentioned that might go to a podcast studio, hire it for a day, record 4 episodes, have them edited up and then share them. But it's a long-term play. So almost I would, if you can, and you definitely can, try and control your own production. Because if you can do your podcast once a week or once every 2 weeks, but even if you do it from your laptop over Zoom, and I'll talk about how we kind of do that. For one, the cost is 100 times lower. But actually you can do it when you want around your own schedules and different bits obs, and you don't have to line up all these different pieces to actually make the thing work. So although I went a bit far with the idea about a production studio, at least it's mine and I can use it whenever I want. But actually it's really important to control that kind of side of things. Okay. So kit is the next one, and I guess cost will come into this as well. So this will come down to your ambition and what you want. That when I first started the kind of live streams and that kind of thing, it was in my spare bedroom at home. It was with a 7-year-old laptop, and I did have some of the cameras, so I'll give you that one. But actually you could start arguably for free just with the stuff you've got. If you own a laptop and that's it, or a smartphone, a little bit harder on the smartphone for the editing, but actually if you own a laptop or a computer, you could start your podcast today, providing you've got a webcam and a microphone. The most basic way to do that is basically have a Zoom call with someone. You can record the call, and then arguably, once you've got the recording, you're done. You can then share that on YouTube and different social media sites. And chances are, if you're watching this, you could probably have the kit to start that, and you could do that today. You could have it done by lunchtime. And actually, it's really important to kind of not worry that you have to buy all this big, expensive stuff. Because actually, the important thing is the quality of the content, not the actual quality of the kit and the cameras. There's no point having a great setup and terrible content. You're much better having great content and a terrible setup. And it's that kind of thing of I'd never let anything slow you down. That some people might want a really advanced setup, and you can absolutely, if you've got the cash, do that. But it also gets a lot more complicated and a lot more things can go wrong. That I'd almost recommend start small, find your feet, and then gradually build up. And that's something we certainly did here. But in terms of the actual kits and stuff, I'm going to come back to that a bit later on. But it was more to do with cost, that actually you can start for free. And then likewise, even some of the podcast hosting platforms are also free. So the one I use for the audio podcast is called Anchor. It was since bought out by Spotify, and I think it's called Spotify for Podcasters or Podcasters for Spotify, you'll find it if you search for it. It was anchor.fm was the website, and that'll forward you to where the new Spotify hosting is. But also, I guess any of your social media platforms can host video now, or audio, which is if that's what you want to do. And then last but not least, on the audio angle, even if you don't have a laptop, but you have a smartphone, you can actually start your first podcast just with voice notes. So for instance, if you know Stephen Bartlett, his podcast, which was Diary of a CEO, was largely, I don't know if it's, obviously he does the interviews now, but it was largely audio only at the start. But the point is, as long as you've got a phone, you can actually start that right now, that you don't need anything else. And it was just something that I wanted to kind of talk about. Okay. So the question on live or pre-record is a really important one to think about, because a lot of this also comes down to your your own time and expertise. That my first ever business in 2009, I think when I first started, it might have been 2008, was a photography business. So I learned a lot about cameras, lighting, setups, what is now 14 years ago. The one things that I've been able to do, because I enjoy it, I'm passionate about it, I've been able to build on that knowledge over time. And also I'm quite techie, I'm quite good at learning stuff. That to build the setup that I have here, where I have the camera, I've got it on a moving slider. We're obviously broadcasting live. It goes out via a software called OBS, which I'll talk about. You'll see the graphics and the clock and the streamers, and we go out live to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, 2 Twitter accounts, the company LinkedIn, Twitch, Instagram, and a few others. You don't jump in to get to that point in from day one. So actually, almost to find your feet, pre-recording your content or in your interview is the easiest way to get started, because what you can do is find a time that works for you and your guest if it's an interview. Basically just set up an interview, and then what you can do is just have a really good conversation with them for half an hour, whatever you wish. And then actually you can then edit that whenever you want, because actually you can either, on something like Fiverr, you can actually find a video editor that can do all the bits and bobs for you, put the graphics on if you want. As well, actually, if you go live, it's 100 times harder to have all the graphics and stuff on live, if that makes sense. At the start of this broadcast, you will see that I had a countdown screen. Then there's this setup, and then actually at the end of the episode, I also go to a closing screen. So I actually use something called a stream deck, which looks something like this. So basically what this is, I guess it's a box that has lots of hotkeys in it, and they have little graphics on, but it allows me to switch between scenes. So that in the software that I use, which is called OBS, which is Open Broadcast Software, you create scenes like you would in a PowerPoint document where you can layer graphics and stuff on top of each other. And what this allows me to do whilst I'm live broadcasting is switch between different views. So when I do different podcasts or interviews for different setups, which could be charities or whichever, I pre-build all of the scenes and how I want it to look in advance. Then all of my cameras and audio go in as an input, which then processes it all together, then broadcasts it out. And basically I can switch it all from here whilst I present. I had a chat with a guy called David Dixon yesterday, and I did admit that when I do these or I do the interviews, because I largely just do it by myself, I'm the only person in this room, the only reason I'm able to do that is through good preparation. And actually that's something that you can do when you live stream. But actually, if you don't have the expertise to do all of this stuff or edit video, pre-recording is definitely the best way to go. And there's lots of people that can kind of help you with that. Okay, time. Time is a funny one because people don't realize how long it takes to do stuff. So my average interview when I get a podcast guest on is about 50 minutes. To organise that interview is probably an hour's worth of work over the course of the prior month, give or take. So it's not a huge amount, that's fine. The interview itself is kind of an hour, but in my day, I block out a good half an hour to set up in advance. I do the interview, but then the actual edit afterwards probably takes me about 2 to 3 hours. And this is someone that's really good at video editing, but also because it was my show and I'm like, I guess, the editor, I can make all the content decisions because it's my thing, so I can do it really quickly. As well, if you actually go to a podcast studio and you have someone else edit it for you, there might be different editorial decisions that you decide to make or not make. Take that bit out, we didn't like that, can you move this around? That it's much harder to then communicate that to other people. But the reason why that's important is because if you've hired a studio, you need to know how much time it's going to take to record each thing. But never also forget the cost of the editing, which is actually the hardest bit, which actually then, you know, kind of plays a part in the economics of, is it worth you investing in all this kind of different stuff. Going back to the cost point of view, that also comes down to it, the fact that when I live stream, all of the graphics are already done because it took me a lot of work in advance. But actually now, when I edit this to go on YouTube, this will just be one long video. But I actually just blade off the start and the end and upload it. So my editing time is now much quicker, if that makes sense. So it's always the payoff between how much production you do up front and how much you do afterwards. But if you look to outsource it, you're probably looking at 3 to 4 hours of editing for a 1 hour video, unless you find someone that's really good and that can kind of do that for you. If you look on Fiverr and various different places, you should be able to find good people that can kind of do that. But don't think that an episode is just the time to record and that's it, because it's definitely not. And actually, both finding the time in your schedule, in your guests' schedule, is really important to kind of think about. One topic that helps really well with that, if you're looking to schedule guests, is a tool called Calendly. So basically it links with your calendar. You input the dates that you're available and you can send that to podcast guests or whoever. And basically they can then pick a time which works best for them. And then linking with your Zoom or whichever you choose to use, that can then automatically set up all the hassle, put it into your diary, and it's a real win-win. As where if you're trying to organize diaries and schedules and that kind of thing, it's really difficult, or it can be difficult to do. So it's just something to worth kind of keeping in mind, I guess. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, and again, if you're really bored watching this, just don't watch it. It's just, I'm trying to brain dump all the different things to help you launch your first podcast, and just things to consider, because often people don't, and that's just something that I wanted to talk about, that because I do quite a lot. Okay, so next is your location. Do you want to record or broadcast from a fixed location, or do you want something that you can move around and do from anywhere? Both are absolutely fine. Both have different pros and cons. I purposely, because I wanted this setup, I have a studio that I broadcast from. But likewise, I'm also a big fan of a lady called Amelia that has her show Chicken Shop Date on YouTube. She does that on different locations. And actually one of the other shows which relates to what she does is called Hot Wings. I always actually had the impression that that was a studio which was fixed in LA, and they got different guests in to interview them whilst they eat hot wings, because it looks immaculate and the same every time. But I found that yesterday that's actually something that they pop up in different places, so they can interview David Beckham or someone else and take the whole studio to London. But the point is, location is really important based on your brand and what you want to do. Because when you actually start to do a podcast and get a feel for everything that kind of goes on, you've got to, accept that most people won't watch the full broadcast. They might only watch 10 seconds, if that. So one of the things I'm always very conscious of with the visuals is to get across the brand and the look and feel, and hopefully have it look professional, even if people only watch 3 seconds of the kind of show. So with the location, I get to do that. But actually, I could arguably still interview people from my laptop from Starbucks, but you might lose something else, but it increases the flexibility, I guess, to you in terms of actually being able to do that, if that kind of makes sense. Okay. Guests. So assuming your podcast isn't just a monologue, a story, or whichever, which it absolutely could be, it can be essentially whatever you want it to be. A lot of what I do is interviewing different guests. So you want to look at who Who do you want to talk to? Why? Don't just talk to people for the sake of talking to them. One of the tricks that some people do is to get on people with a bigger following or a following that you would like to tap into, that actually then might help you grow your profile and grow your awareness in the industry of what you do through interviewing different people. And because you interview this guy and other people like that guy, they then discover who you are. So there's always an important thing to think about who and why you want to talk to. Relating to guests is also the location. So I've got a friend called Alex that runs a really fantastic podcast, but he chooses to interview people in person in his studio, which is in Gateshead next to Newcastle. But one of the challenges that you have if you interview people in person, face to face, I did one with an organization called Umi about 2 weeks ago, is that you both need to align diaries to both set something up. You have to account for travel time, but also you have to be able to get to wherever you're going to do the interview, either if you go to the guest or if the guest comes to you. And that can be a barrier, because if you got the chance to interview Bill Gates or Elon Musk or someone, but they're in California, unless you had the budget or wanted to, that might be difficult. Or it's someone in London or 4 hours away or whichever. So one of the things that I purposely choose to do is that I interview my guests on Zoom. So the way that I do this is that on the software that I mentioned before called OBS, which is Open Broadcast Software, to my guest, they dial into a Zoom call and they see me through the camera. I've got my earpiece in, I've got my microphone set up. So to them, it's a Zoom call. But on my end, essentially what I then do is take that input from the call, so their audio and visual, run it through the software to then combine with my original audio and video, and then we broadcast that. But the reason why I do it that way is that Mark, who I interviewed last week, dialed in from Reading. The chap the week before, David, was near Cornwall. Andrew was in London. But you can interview guests anywhere in the world, providing you get the time zone and the time scale right, and you can make that work. But actually, it's a really important thing to think about when you first look to set up your podcast, is both who are the guests you want to talk to, and then what's the physical location. As in, you can still be in a studio as I am now, and the guest can dial in, or you can essentially create what you want. But it's a really important thing to just think about, just as you look to do that. Okay, next. So one of the big topics that people always ask about first is the camera. What is the camera that I should get, and how should it work, and how does it, what people always want to know, what should I buy? So this depends on your budget, your space that you have, and actually how interested you are in cameras and lighting and that kind of thing. Because the truth is, if your laptop has a basic webcam, that's all you need. You don't need anything else. You can choose to get, more expensive cameras and lighting and different kind of stuff, but you don't have to, and that's worth kind of keeping in mind. I'm going to jump into this. So I use Canon cameras. The camera that I'm broadcasting on now is called a Canon EOS RP. And the reason why I use Canons is that my first photography business was I used Canons. I know them really well. I understand them. I know how to use them. But actually with a mirrorless camera or a digital SLR camera, essentially what you can do is that you can control everything about the shot in terms of what's called the depth of field, if you want to blur the background, or the shutter speed to make it brighter or darker. And there's so many different things that you can change that actually give you a lot more creative control than if you just use the webcam, where often the webcam will just use software and you'll get like an average picture. But if you want to go for a really advanced setup, that kind of helps. On the camera body itself, I purposely choose Canon's mirrorless cameras because it allows me to export. So this camera that you're on is actually exporting via a USB-C to HDMI cable, and it goes from there into my iMac, into the software, and then it broadcasts. But the reason why that's important is that you can see, and what we broadcast is what the camera sees, if that makes sense, which is how I want it to look. You can actually buy very expensive cinema cameras, which in theory give you a better high quality output, but it needs post-production. So actually there's always an element of what you choose to do. Likewise with the mirrorless cameras or the DSLR, if you're a bit older, there's always a choice between a full frame camera or what's called a cropped sensor camera. I apologize, I'm going quite technical, but I don't care, just skip past it if you're not interested. But basically a crop sensor camera is generally a cheaper camera, where essentially it's like you've zoomed in slightly. And the reason why that's important is that if you're in a small room and you only have a certain amount of space to play with, the lens will be more zoomed in on your face. That actually some people want that look, some people don't. A full frame camera basically takes the crop sensor and it's almost as if you've stepped back 2-3 feet. So you can see more of the room, which is important when you then come to your lens choice about the choice that you want, how it works and what you want the effect to be. The lens on this camera is actually a 24-70 f4 RF lens. So that is a wide angle lens which allows me to show the whole room. And this shot is about 35 millimeters just in terms of focal length if you're interested. And I purposely shoot this shot at f4. So pretty much everything in shot is in focus. And that's a conscious thing because of the type of shot and what we do. This camera I have here is the exact same Canon EOS RP body as this one. But actually this lens I have here is basically, it's a 50mm prime lens, which is called f1.2. It's an RF lens. This lens is really, really expensive. The lens alone is about £2,500. The body is about 1,200. But what this lens allows you to do, it allows you to blur the background. So for instance, on films and in TV, when you see the character in perfect focus, but it's blurred behind them, it's what you see in movies to make it look cool. You need certain types of lenses to do that. You don't have to spend £2,500 to get the kit to allow you to do it. This lens is actually very similar. So this is a 50mm prime lens. It's f1.8, so it's not quite as good as the f1.2, but you can pick these up for about £100–150, and most people won't be able to tell the difference. It's only because I'm a nightmare, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I wanted the best. But there are still subtle differences. So for instance, the focus speed, the cameras that I also pick have eye autofocus. So when I'm stood, especially if you're looking to blur the background, you need the focus to be perfect. And modern cameras now can find your eye and focus on it so that basically it gives you the effect you want. As well, when I first started to do video 10+ years ago, 15 years ago, you had to manually focus the shot and then try and stand in the right place, and it was a nightmare. But actually more expensive lenses focus quicker, and there's a lot of other nuance to it, but you don't have to spend £4,000 on a camera. You can actually use a webcam if you want, and that'll be absolutely fine. I wouldn't worry about that too much. On sound, so audio is where I would focus the most. What I'm recording on right now is a wireless microphone, so it's called a Rode Wireless Go. These tiny little things, and this is a wireless microphone which allows me to walk around, and it wirelessly transmits from, I have this lavalier mic which is clipped to me here, goes to the transmitter which is on my belt, and it transmits to my iMac where the input goes in, and you can walk around. And hopefully the sound on this is more than adequate, and it works great. If you wanted to go for what people view as a traditional podcast setup, the microphones are slightly different. So often they then go to a wired microphone, and I won't go into all the nuance on it, but essentially you have something called an XLR cable, which is a really thick, chunky cable, which you have to plug into another piece of kit before you can plug it into your computer. But this is the microphone. I think this was a Sennheiser, no, Behringer. This was a really highly recommended microphone, which I think was 20 quid. So it's £20 for this microphone. The cable was about 20 because I went for a good one. Then there was another piece of kit which you need, which is about 60. I'll put a link in the description. But the audio from this is like deeper and bassier, and you have it quite close to your mouth, often with a pop filter, which is to remove like when you spit on the microphone or blow into it so it doesn't crackle. And I chose, when I wanted to upgrade my setup and move to this room, to go from this, which was about 15–20 quid, So this is the Shure SM7B. This is what Joe Rogan and other people use, Logan Paul. So all of the famous podcasters, Stephen Bartlett, used one of these. This microphone was like £400, plus you need something else, which is about another £200. So give or take 600 versus 15-20. For most people, when you then broadcast on a live stream, they can't hear the difference. It looks a bit cooler if you know what you're looking for, but actually you do not have to spend the money on this. You don't even have to spend the money on this. But the idea is actually, you know, some people want to for the look and the aesthetic and everything else, but you absolutely don't have to. But relating to the sound, I also like to stand up when I do my podcasts, because for one, you can get more energy in your voice and actually it keeps me more engaged, and it's just what I choose to do. So you'll see that I actually have these high tables, which you can kind of see here, which I keep my kit on, I speak to my guest, I do that kind of thing. Some people prefer to sit down, that's absolutely up to you, but you don't have to. It's that kind of thing, it's a judgment call. I just choose to stand up. But because I'm 6'3", what that then means is that the tripod and the stuff that I use to hold my camera also has to be quite high. And that is again a judgment call on the kit and stuff that you want to do and use. One of the other big things which is really important about the sound, it's called a feedback. So for instance, if you normally just use a normal laptop where it has a built-in microphone, you speak to someone, but the sound you hear from the guest comes out through your speakers, there's a chance that your microphone can pick that up. And occasionally I do hear it when I interview guests, where you get some, it's not feedback, but you can hear yourself a little bit, and it is a bit off-putting. So one of the things I choose to do, I actually have an earpiece, which is like this. This was only about 20 quid on Amazon. And basically that clips to the back of my shirt. I have an earpiece which goes in. But what that means is that when I have the audio from my computer, it goes into my ear, it's not broadcast into the room, which means there's no chance of the microphone picking it up. And actually, I would recommend that you do that, because actually your quality will improve quite a lot. But actually, if anything, out of everything that I've mentioned today, the audio and sound is probably the most important thing to focus on, but you don't have to spend a lot of money to kind of make that work. The other thing that I'll say about guests is also plan in advance. So actually on my camera, what I have out of eyeline, I have one of these flexible bendy arms. So I actually just below the camera have my list of questions for each guest, which basically just means that whilst I'm talking to them, I can just glance off, check that I'm in the right place, and continue the conversation without having to look down. And actually that's just it's a really important trick, is just how you want it to feel like a nice conversation. That, for me at least, I think it's really important to be able to see the guest that you're talking to. I spoke to someone recently, and they had a nice camera set up, but they couldn't see me, so they were going purely on the sound of my voice. And the interview was a bit stunted because they couldn't read my body language or react. And considering a huge amount of communication is in the visuals and the body language and that kind of thing, I think you miss something. So one of my personal things that I choose to do, I have a TV or a screen which actually sits behind the camera. And what that means is that I have the guest slightly above the eye line, which means that when I speak to the guest, I found out quite early on that actually if I stare into the camera lens, for the viewer, it can be quite abrasive. It's quite intense that someone's kind of staring you out. As well, when you look just above the camera line, you get the impression that someone's engaged and they're talking to you, but it's not quite as intense that they're kind of staring you out. So that's a nuanced thing, but just something to keep in mind. Realistically, a normal setup on a normal laptop will be absolutely fine. Okay, so next we're going to talk about lighting. After sound, lighting and good lighting is more important than a good camera. You can have a brilliant camera and terrible lighting, and you're kind of wasting your time. The light is the most important thing. If you can, especially when you're starting out, use natural light. So use a big window or a nice bright open space, because what that will do is give you a nice uniform illumination on you, and you'll look good, and the camera will be able to work to its best settings based on natural light. That should always be your kind of number one go-to. One thing that often helps, and I certainly do this, is you can support natural light with other external lights, which actually just light the scene or you how you want to. So when I do my kind of podcast interviews, I actually have 2 of these. So I bought these on Amazon. I actually have tons of these. There's actually 6 on the roof right now above my head. And what I do with these is that when I interview someone, because I wear glasses, you get reflection. So I actually light these at the side of my face. So basically what that does, it means that I'm well lit, but there's no reflection that you can see in the glass of my glasses. And also I would recommend going for, they're basically called white balance. So it's 4,800 Kelvin. So it's white lights because it's a lot more natural. Often you get white lights or yellow lights. I run all of my lights on all of my setups. It's classed as like the daylight setting. And you know, it's a really important thing to kind of think about. If you have a really professional setup, you might choose to go for lights that you can change between different color temperatures, but I wouldn't worry about that kind of too much. For this setup, I purposely wanted the room that actually looked the same 24 hours a day. So I have a lot of sound protection and curtains around the room, but also I have a lot of expensive lighting, which both lights the whole room, it bounces off the roof. But also I have 2 lights there, I have 2 lights there, I have 2 lights above my head. That basically then what you're trying to do is light the subject, so in this case me, both in terms of so that I'm lit appropriately for the scene that I'm in. A really good technique, if you get used to it, is called a hair light. So I have 2 above my head, which light the back of my head, which give kind of 3-dimensionality to the scene. But then also you'll see what's called practical lighting. So you have the 2 lamps either side, and actually we have lighting behind the TV. And what that's meant to do is just provide interest within the scene, but not detract from me, if that makes sense. But it's almost worth thinking about both you, but also the background and the scene that you're in terms of what you want to look like and sound like. But this sound is definitely the most important thing that you want to do. Okay. Also, I apologize, there's a lot to go through, but if you really want to start a podcast, this is stuff that you need to know. Okay. Editing. So I finish this broadcast, or I finish the interview. I personally choose to use something called Final Cut Pro 10. I use Macs on both Mac and PC. There are hundreds of different types of video editing software. You can get as complicated or as simple as you like, but actually most, I use Macs, but most PCs or Macs or laptops come with some form of basic video editing software. What you can do if you want to, and it's absolutely fine, is just record from Zoom. So you get your output, we have your 2 windows, but generally there's like a black bar or a black thing around it, which is just what you normally see on Zoom. And then what you can either do is just blade off the start and the end. So you start the show at the start of the conversation and you end at the end of the conversation. Obviously cut off all of the intro bits or the chat afterwards. But also with video editing software, what you can also do is overlay graphics. So there's something called a PNG, which is a graphic file which has elements of transparency to it. So what you can then do is create a graphic which aligns with your brand, which basically sits over the interview window so that you get the finished product that looks how you want it to look. But actually it's quite simple to do. You could either pay someone else to do this for you, or what I would recommend is just a bit of practice to kind of learn how to do it yourself. On Macs, it's called iMovie, which is the original one, or if you pay, you can get Final Cut Pro. I'm not entirely sure on PCs, but there'll be loads of ways and things that you can do that. But the other way to do it, if you want to live broadcast, is using the software I mentioned before, which is called OBS, which is Open Broadcast Software. And what that allows you to do is effectively create the same graphics, but you pre-do them so it's live. And what that then means is that allows you to create the scene and create the visual you want and broadcast instantly. And that's how I choose to do it. Even if I was going to still pre-record an interview for a later broadcast at a later date, Personally, I would still record via OBS to have everything on, all the graphics and stuff that I want, because it just makes it so much easier. But you don't have to. You absolutely, it's completely up to you. And then last but not least, at 10:17, so I've been talking for 37 minutes now, 47 minutes, is through distribution. So one of the, I guess, misnomers, misconsumption, my mind's gone blank. One of the misconceptions that people have is that you create a podcast, you put it onto Spotify or Google or Apple Play Store or whichever, and you'll just get a million views and loads of people watch it. And the truth is they won't, and that's cool, but just to know that up front. You really want to focus on creating good content, but actually sharing on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. And the idea is that often the interview is only the start. That's the creation of the first bulk piece of content. But actually the ability to edit it, change it up, remix it, post just clips of the whole thing onto social is actually where you'll get the most value. So although my average interview might be 50 minutes, it's often the 5-minute best bit clip where I just take the most interesting bits and just share that. Often gets the most traction, but the actual one single piece of content can be clipped up to become 20 other different bits of content. That what I would really recommend is on your distribution and social media, never think of it as a one and done. What you're doing is creating content, or if you get interviewed for someone else, how can you put your brand on it and then send it out again? And make sure all the little tricks, like tag the people that you want to talk to, or the companies or the organizations. Use your hashtags and your SEO to help get more traction. And one of the things that I've really found on YouTube especially, there's so much stuff on there that you have to go mega niche to really find your audience. Because realistically, and this is something that I still get wrong, a lot of my content is still too generic that actually it struggles to break through the algorithm against other stuff that other people follow. So if you look at my own YouTube, I probably follow 300 different creators, but the algorithm probably shows me my most popular 10, and the other 290 will still be making great content, but just the algorithm doesn't show it to me, except on rare occasions. But that's important to know, because actually it doesn't mean that your stuff isn't valuable. It just means that for whatever reason, YouTube isn't pushing it to that audience. But for me, LinkedIn is actually my main audience. So that's why I kind of clip it up and repost it, and it seems to do okay there. But don't get disheartened if it doesn't quite have the reach that you want it to, etc. So I think about 50 minutes in, that is, I'm going to call it quits there. But if you want to start your own podcast, as I've kind of mentioned, why do you want to do it? Is it for business reasons? Is it for fun? Are you lonely? You just want to talk to people? You want to make friends? You want to sell stuff? Whatever it is, just have a note to yourself why you want to do it. What topic do you want to talk about, and why? Why are you passionate about it, and why do you feel that you want to talk about that kind of thing and not someone else? The kit, you don't need mega advanced sophisticated stuff. You can actually start with some fairly basic stuff and get started, and I would recommend that just to see if you enjoy kind of doing it. Consider whether you want to live stream or pre-record. Pre-recording is a lot easier, and I would recommend you start there. But there are big benefits to live broadcasting if you can. Your location, do you want to record from a fixed studio like I do here? Or do you want to just travel around with your laptop? That's kind of absolutely cool. And then relating to that for your guests, do you want to interview your guests in person in a studio? Or do you want to do it remotely online by Zoom or whichever? Both are absolutely fine, but you get pros and cons with both. Realistically, in person, you're probably going to get a better connection and a better interview, but logistically, it's a lot harder to get people there. Plus, it often takes up a lot more time than just being able to dial in from Zoom or whichever. Cameras, to be honest, if you have a laptop or you have a basic webcam, that's more than fine. You can spend more, but only if you really want to. I would focus on sound. Again, for 20, 50 quid, you can get something which is more than good enough. You can spend thousands, but it won't necessarily make it better. or even if it does make it better, most people won't notice. So it's worth just keeping in mind on that one. Lighting is important, but if you can use natural light, but then if you choose to have a scene like this, which is, I guess, professionally lit, I use daylight white balance. So it's almost where they're kind of white lights. I have a range of different lights that I use, all from different bits and bobs. I'll put links in the comments. Editing, never forget the edit. The actual pre-record and the record of the interviews, the quick bit, it's probably going to take 2-3 times that amount of time to then edit, export, and then share and do the distribution. So don't think it's a quick process, but remember that if you're looking to outsource it to other people or hire a studio, there will be other costs probably involved, just to be aware of. And then last but not least, just in terms of distribution and stuff as well. So I use, for the audio podcast, was a website that was called anchor.fm, which has been recently bought out by Spotify. That's why I send the audio file to all the different platforms. So the Google podcast platform and Apple and Spotify and others. But the other distribution channels, I go direct to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch and Instagram and TikTok and all of those kind of bits and bobs as well. So hopefully, if you're interested in launching a podcast, that might have been useful. This is the kit I use. This is my setup. I've hopefully tried to explain how and why it all works. But if you have any questions or comments, drop them in the chat or whichever, and I'll happily help if I can. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you soon. All right, cheers, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.